Shall I introduce James? I mean,
go ahead,
I'm sure many people know him, but yeah, I mean, I know that his courses, more than his courses, his website, Kinetic Revolution, is incredibly popular with podiatrists and patients alike. And yeah, it's our pleasure to have James Dunne with us, JD, as I'm going to refer to him from this point. And we've known each other 7 years. I was trying to work this out, 6 or 7 years.
I think it probably is 7. Yeah, I reckon it's probably 2011, maybe. Yeah, 7 years.
7, yeah.
Yeah, so mate, thank you very much for inviting me on. It's great to chat with you guys.
Yeah, we always wanted a topic in the world of podiatry that I think is more popular than it's ever been, gathering more momentum. And I knew you'd say yes, because I knew that you owed me a favour, because I did one of these for you before once. So yeah, it was an easy one for me to decide upon. So yeah, some of the stuff we're going to talk about, just to give people a bit of a feel for it. And obviously, as we're going along, do engage, do ask questions. But we're going to talk a bit about the running coach podiatrist relationship that James and I have, and that we think is valuable, and why it's probably good for everyone to have that kind of relationship with someone. And then get into the nitty gritty, really, when it comes to changing the way people run. What can we change? What should we look for? What should we possibly change? When should we change it? Because it isn't a indiscriminate thing to do. And of course, then the how we change it, the clinical sort of tips. And as we go along, if any questions come in, we'll sort of Craig will give us the nod and we'll bat them away as well. Let's see how we're going. Steve Wells has just commented, Craig, saying, "No video, guys. Am I doing something wrong? Is it working as far as you're aware?" Doesn't seem that anyone else has complained of that.
I've got it.
Yeah?
I've got video, Ian.
Okay, good. Everything. And Craig, you got video?
Sorry, everything's working fine. I had my mute button on. Dogs are barking again.
I wondered what was going on. So we've got video, we've got audio. Okay, well, should we get cracking then?
Yep.
We've got 20 people online. So, yeah. Super. So let's talk about our relationship, James, our professional relationship. Said we've known each other 7 years, and when we first met, I'll be honest, I was a bit reticent to have a relationship with a running coach, because my understanding at the time was they're just going to make everyone I send to them run the same way. You know, they're just going to tell everyone to do this with their arms, or this with their cadence, this with their stride length. And we met and we got on well and we shared some patience, and it just couldn't have been further from the truth. I guess what I'd love to know from you is, what was your first reticence or concern about possibly having a relationship with a podiatrist? What was your opinion of us?
I'm glad you went there. Because I was going to come back with exactly this. I definitely had my reservations as well. As much as you were thinking, oh, here we go, he's going to get all my patients doing X, Y, or Z in a cookie cutter kind of fashion. I thought, all right, okay, here we go. Anyone I send this way is going to potentially be treated with again the same one size fits all. Let's just stick them in a pair of orthoses and off we go. But couldn't have been further from the truth. It's been really good getting to know you and getting to understand that you think a bit differently and a bit more open-minded than perhaps I have, perhaps unfairly, given the profession. It's preconception. I don't know, but no, it's been very good to have that challenge and come out the better side for it.
Yeah, I agree. And our relationship works well. We've shared, I dread to think how many runners we've shared. I've sent people your way, you've sent people my way. There may be people watching who don't have that sort of referral network with a running coach. Sort of for the podiatrists watching, why do you think we need a running coach? Do you think we need a running coach in our sort of MDT?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'll be interested to kind of hear your thoughts on this, but from my point of view, if I were to sit in your shoes and think about the ongoing care of a runner who comes to you, let's say with plantar fasciitis, for example, obviously you've got your treatment plan in place and the various different interventions you can put in place. But what happens then when they get back into their running? What happens when they then start back on their return to running program and then into perhaps training for a half marathon or a marathon. It's one thing being able to obviously affect their symptoms in the short term and set them on the right path rehab wise, but we all know that there are different types of patient when it comes to compliance as much as anything else. So on one hand, you could be speaking to a runner who you give all the right advice, and you can send them in the direction of here's a link which will give you a decent example of a return to running program, but that's what you need to do, and they'll do it and they'll be fine. But on the other hand, you may have someone who is going to be a complete nightmare, and as soon as they walk out of your clinic, they'll get going with whatever you've given them, and all of a sudden throw a whole load of volume back into their running. And if they're used to running 50 miles a week, backing off to them might be running 30 miles a week, and they need someone like perhaps myself in their ear to say, why don't we get a little bit more progressive with this? Why don't we actually build you up gradually with this? Understanding what Ian's done, understanding what Craig's done, understanding what we need to do from a rehab perspective, how we can integrate the rehab side, because I'm not just a running coach, I'm a sports rehab therapist as well. So that kind of from an exercise therapy point of view sits really well hand in hand. And how can we start to, again, build the resilience in the right areas, as well as managing the training load at the same time, to build you back to where you need to be from a training perspective. So from a podiatrist point of view, if you're happy doing that yourself, work away, fantastic. But I've got a feeling that there are plenty of podiatrists out there who are very comfortable doing what they're doing, but will put their hands up and say, when it comes to actually managing runners day in, day out, they'd probably do with a hand. What would you say?
Yeah, I utterly agree with you. I mean, I also believe that even if we, have a good understanding of load management, a good understanding of return to run protocols, about how to manipulate some of the things we're going to talk about, and I'd like to think I've got a reasonable understanding of that, it still doesn't mean we have to do it. I mean, some people might want to, but I've truly always believed that we approach things as a team, and as a team we all have an understanding of what we do, but we still play to our strengths. Yeah, so in the same way that if I think they need a sort of a load protocol for a tendinopathic Achilles, I'm not saying I can't do it, but I'd always refer on to our mutual colleague, physiotherapist Brad, for example. So I always like to play to my strengths, have an understanding of what you do. It just helps me when I refer on to you. And I think patients, certainly London types that we tend to see, they respond to having a running coach. That term, I have a running coach now, they respond to that really well. I don't know whether it's a psychological thing, but they suddenly feel like they're perhaps a little bit more serious.
Yeah, I definitely think, particularly for the real kind of type A guys that you're talking about, I think that's very true. I also think from an accountability point of view, we've got to look at what brought them to your front door in the first place, Ian. We've got to understand that, as much as the biomechanical side, and obviously we're going to get right into this later on, as much as the biomechanical side is important, the biggest issue we see amongst runners is training load mismanagement, and creating overload in that respect. So what led them to the point where they found their point of failure? Do they need to actually have someone take their training program in hand so that we don't get back to that point? So not forget, but let's not just talk about the reintroduction to running. Let's reverse engineer what went wrong, and make sure that doesn't happen again. And that's a really important thing as well. So
actually, just on that, James, I remember when I picked up Peter Larson's book, Tread Lightly, which I assume you read, the chapter in there on injuries. And I think in the first paragraph of that chapter, he said something that I really rolled my eyes at. And he said the best way to prevent an injury was don't run 1 day a week. And I thought, what? But the more I thought about it, it's exactly what you said. It's managing the load. It's giving the tissues a chance to recover. And even though I reacted quite negatively initially, I've sort of come around to really, and I think that's what's changed, and probably most of my understanding about running is the load management. It's managing the loads. It's the recovery is probably just as important, if not more important, than the actual training.
Definitely, could not agree more. And this time of year for us up here in the Northern Hemisphere, as we're in spring marathon season, February, March, we're going to see lots of people who are unfortunately getting that slightly off center in terms of not just the load management, the intensity, and all sorts of different variables there are, of course. So it's just having someone on hand to be able to give them that second pair of eyes. I'm my own worst clients. I'll put my hands up to that, definitely. There's something very difficult about being objective with your own running when you're, even when you're not a running coach, when you're a runner out there training for a marathon, and you know what you want to do, you know what you're trying to do, and you are torn between this plan, and you see what your friends are doing. It's very hard to be objective. So having someone on hand to actually bounce ideas against, and say, listen, why don't we just back off here and give you an extra rest day here, and not get back into that angry Achilles state, then that will actually allow you to be consistent in your training. And off air, a second ago, we were talking about performance versus rehab, and the fact that we really wanted to focus on the sort of the rehab, the injury side of things, rather than talk about performance. And that makes me really happy, because I really, really shy away when it comes to the technique side of things, when it comes to the question of what can I do to run faster. I don't want to necessarily straight away say, well, in fact, I don't really at all want to say, well, we can do X, Y, and Z, and straight away you're going to PB over 5K, 10K, half marathon, because it's all nonsense. The truth is, you need to run more consistently. And the problem with running consistently for a lot of runners is that they're breaking down. That's what's stopping them from running consistently. So if we can get them to a place by managing volume, intensity, frequency, etc. of their running, managing their training plan, to a point where they're no longer breaking down, they can run consistently, that's where they get faster. It's as simple as that. And if you have that conversation with runners, then all of a sudden, hopefully they start to get it.
Mm-hmm.
Can we just go to a question? There's a really good one that's come in. I think now's a perfect time to ask it. It's from Dave James up in Birmingham, and he sort of said, it seems logical. He actually spent the day with me in clinic on Friday down in London, and so he's sort of got a bit of a vibe for the way we do things in that sort of real team approach at Pure Sports Medicine. He said, having access to a running coach seems logical. James, what are we looking for in a running coach, especially for those of us outside of big cities? And I think it's a great point, because I always feel like I got lucky with you. Or maybe I didn't. Maybe everyone's, maybe you are the perfect standard. But I think a couple of things to say. The first is, when we're looking for relationships with running coaches, what are the alarm bells? I guess one of them might be someone who's promising performance, from the sound of what you just said. What are the other alarm bells for podiatrists looking for that relationship? How do we spot a good and a bad one?
So it's difficult. There are so many different, different ways of getting to the point where you're coaching runners. Whether you're coming at it from the angle that I'm coming at it, where first and foremost, I'm, as I said, sports rehab therapist who now works with runners solely, or whether you're someone who's gone down the UK athletics route, and perhaps they've done a run leader award or something like that, and then they built on that with coaching accreditations, and they've got no real background in terms of understanding the injury side, which, from my point of view, when you are dealing with runners and knowing that the biggest risk to a runner is injury, far more than it is getting your nutrition wrong on race day or something like that. The biggest challenge is getting to the start line in one piece. Ideally, we want someone who has at least some sort of background in terms of sports rehab, sports therapy, in terms of physio. Someone who's got some sort of background there. Obviously, that's going to limit the pool quite a lot. If we looked at it the other way around, what I'd back away from potentially is someone who specifically aligns themselves with. This is difficult, because actually I'm going to disagree with myself. I'm going to say it first. Someone who aligns themselves straight away with a brand name. So someone who says, I'm a pose coach, or I'm a chi running coach, or I'm a Vivo barefoot coach, or something like that. That for me straight away is red flag, red flag, red flag. Problem is, I'm really happy saying that. I'm fine saying that, but I also have a very good friend, a guy called Gait Retraining, who is in London. He's in North London, probably not a million miles away from a bunch of your guys, Ian. But he actually changed my mind a little bit about chi running, because I was very much of the opinion that it's one size fits all, blah, blah, blah. And he's the guy who's now in charge of coach development amongst, or basically certification in UK, Ireland, and maybe Europe now for those guys. But he actually said some really, I hope he wasn't just telling me what I wanted to hear, but said some really smart things in terms of being far from cookie cutter and looking at athletes from a more holistic, let's say, point of view without getting into it. So that I guess for me was a moment where I was challenged around my preconceptions about cheat running. But in general, because he, in my mind, I'd still position as the exception, not the rule. He's the guy who is trying to push that organisation forwards on this side of the Atlantic. But there are going to be plenty of coaches out there who are just going to take a textbook approach based on what they've been taught on a weekend course and apply the same thing to everybody. So yeah, I'd probably stand by my first statement.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, the situation in Australia is they have, I assume it's very similar to the UK, where there is quite a formal coaching pathway with various stages they have to go through. And then on the other side of the coin, we have what you were talking about, the red flag coaches. And I think there are two groups. And at the end of the day, unless you're familiar with that structure, especially around Athletics Australia, you don't know that there are these people who've had to go through quite a rigorous process and mentoring, covering a whole lot of topics from nutrition to psychology to, and then, as you said, we have those that do the weekend course on how to be a coach of a particular cult, is what I'll call it. So, yeah, it's...
Yeah, and what I'd say around that as well is, again, whether you're looking for someone who, again, has been through the various certification process with your national governing body, or whether it's someone who is a personal trainer who has found his way into working with lots of runners, there is another approach. We're talking to Dave, aren't we? So another approach, Dave, taking someone under your wing. If you've got a running coach in mind, and you're thinking that logistically it makes sense for you guys to work together, logistically it makes sense for you to have a relationship professionally to co-manage runners, there's going to be lots that you can probably learn from hopefully an experienced running coach from a coaching perspective and a managing training load perspective, but there's going to be lots that coach can learn from you in terms of understanding when to refer on, understanding their limits around those conversations they have trackside. When do you say, well, perhaps you should try and stretch your calves a little bit more versus, okay, we need to get you off to see Dave, we need to get you off to see Ian, we need to get you off to see Craig. That kind of informal structure, that kind of informal mentoring is going to benefit everybody, but most importantly, the runners that you're both looking after. I think, Ian, that's something that through the last 7 years of yourself, particularly Brad, I think I've had more contact with Brad than I have you, just because of the course and all that sort of thing. I've definitely had that from Brad, and I hope to think he's had the same from me. The fact that we just talk about stuff, and he has dragged me on kicking and screaming, and hopefully I've done the same to him.
We just had another question come
I
in.
agree. And I think God, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we just had a question come in, James, from Kylie Williams. Now, Kylie was one of our previous guests on this, and she's just asked this question about, when do our serious teenagers need to consider a running coach, and what do we do to make sure that the coach understands the growing body? Now, Kylie's background is she treats a lot of pediatric patients, but she's also got 2 teenagers, so she might be asking about her own kids here. I don't know.
Okay, first and foremost, I don't really do much with kids. I haven't since my last paid employment elsewhere, which was, I suppose, 2009, 2010, where I was working with academy footballers, and we saw lots of severs in particular, actually, rather than much else. But it from a developmental point of view. But I think one thing that really stands out from an adolescent point of view is the coordination side of things. And I know we want to talk about a little bit about drills later on. If we get into that, maybe we will, maybe we won't. But something that I found really interesting working with those youngsters, especially seeing them from a footballer perspective, season in, season out, and often seeing them at pre-season, is that year in, year out, you'd be presented with a very different child by the same name. One year to another, all of a sudden there's been a massive growth spurt, and coordination-wise they go out the window, and there's a lot of sort of retraining to be done from a footwork perspective, and we're moving away from running now, but from a perspective in that respect. So it's certainly something to take into account. But from an injury perspective, again, I think it's just the same as everybody else. It's about listening to your body, and knowing that there will be aches and pains, and knowing that there are various different very specific adolescent type issues, like I said, that we need to look at and we need to keep an eye out for. But the problem a lot of the time I've found with kids in the past is that they're not brilliant at what's the word, articulating quite what they're feeling and where they're feeling it. So actually listening to them and trying to spot the signs of when they need to back off, rather than allowing them to go like a bull at a gate, which if me is anything to go by at that age, I was the most active kid. It's getting 10 foot off the gas is important.
Yeah, that's been my experience with kids. Is you can do everything right, but they'll still sprint around the playground at lunchtime and stuff like that. Sort of, no matter how much you plead with them, they don't tend to listen too well to yeah.
I think the summary for me, and it kind of brings together Dave's question and Kylie's question, is the things I would be fearful of in a coach. Firstly, if it was a coach, someone who was coaching kids, would be when I asked them about what they were being asked to do, it was clear that they were just being beasted. That classic coach that just beast kids. That for me is a big warning, more than anything else. And kind of coming back to what Dave said, my concern when I met you, which was quickly kind of quashed, of course, was anyone that applies a blanket approach, a recipe book, a cookbook approach. And like we said, that works both ways. So just the same way that we should be mindful that a podiatrist that treats everyone the same way and just dishes out orthoses is probably not someone a relationship is going to go well with. It's same for me with coaches. It's just about being individual to the person in front of you. I must admit, I don't see many kids, as you know, because of where I'm based in London. So I can't add much to Kylie's question. I don't send kids off to you because I don't see them myself particularly. So how many kids do you see? Do you see none at all? Or what's the youngest you see who's on your books at the moment? Surely you must have a coach, someone who you've coached who's...
Yeah, I mean,
I'm thinking you must have someone who you've coached that you love.
Youngest in the last few years.
Sorry, delay. Sorry.
No, it's all right. Youngest in the last few years, 16-year-old, and they are very few and far between. There've been a couple of 16-year-olds, but other than that, it's mostly your kind of mid-20s and upwards recreational runner and triathlete that I see. But actually, on the note you just kind of began to go into there, Ian, an important point that I wanted to add around, again, the kind of the beasting point of view, in a similar respect to that, is firstly, we don't want to see coaches who just coach kids like little adults, okay, because that's not going to work. We need to take into account the fact they are kids. I think sometimes you do just get, again, some coaches who've found themselves in a position where they're teaching kids and they're just trying to apply the philosophy here to the fact that, yes, they're younger and off we go. But even more important, I think, is the whole conversation around specialism. I have never really thought about putting a specific age on this kind of conversation or my thoughts around this conversation. But if I had to be put on the spot now and put myself on the spot and think of an age, I'd say probably it wouldn't be until maybe university years that I'd really want to see someone specialise and say, yeah, I absolutely want to be a distance runner. I absolutely want to be a Y or Z. I would want to see that you're taking the approach as a coach of looking at a kid who might be extremely talented as a, lacrosse player, and saying, brilliant, very talented lacrosse player, let's try and build him as a little athlete in the same way as we're trying to build the distance runner as a little athlete, in the same way that we're trying to build a javelin thrower as a little athlete, and then allow them, so perhaps we're looking at a 16-year-old now at this point, then allow them, as they kind of progress age-wise as much as anything else, to then make that decision for themselves as to where they want to get really specific. Now, of course, that doesn't necessarily work super practically if we're talking about swimmers and things like that, because the volume that those kids have to do at a very young age is nuts. But I think as a general philosophy, building little athletes who are just athletic and capable and are rounded as athletes is a really smart way to go, rather than just going too specialised too soon. What do you think about that?
No, that's actually well supported by the data. I off the top of my head, I can recall 2 studies that showed the earlier sports specialisation starts, the greater the risk for injury. So kids do better across multi-sports, and as a parent, I'm following that philosophy. I mean, my girls start high school next year. We might start looking at getting a little bit more specialised then, but trying to get as wide a variety as possible. Gymnastics, building that core up. They'll choose later what they want to do. So but it's well supported by the.
I don't have kids, but I can fully see myself when the time comes being really supportive of the whole idea of saying, what about gymnastics club? Because I just think that gives such a solid grounding for anything else you want to do.
Okay. The first ever sports medicine conference I went to was in 1981. And I still remember a presentation by an orthopedic surgeon. His name was Johnson. I can't remember his first name. And he talked about kids in sport. We're talking 1981. He said kids should do 2 things. They should run, and they should do gymnastics. And his logic was that will then set them up for when they get a bit older to be ready to do whatever sport they want to choose to do. And that's it's stuck in my mind since then. That kind of makes sense.
Yeah, movement. That's the bottom line. Move.
So, should we get stuck into some of the running technique stuff?
Yes.
It seems sensible to, because there may be some people listening who I'm sure the audience of podiatrists listening all look at people move. They all do gait analyses of varying descriptions. When it comes to looking at a runner, rather than looking at things through our podiatric lens, as a running coach, the big things to look at. Certainly the questions that came in beforehand were all around step length and cadence and that relationship. So if you could touch on that first, that'd be great. Then step width. And then is there anything we should be looking at, even though we're the lower body guys, or, is there anything we should be looking at, upper body, arm swing, posture, etc. So take it away.
Cool. Fantastic. Okay. Well, you set me up really nicely there, actually, Ian. So thank you for that. When it comes to particularly describing what we're seeing from a start point, in terms of thinking just, from a 2D perspective, 2D gait analysis perspective, thinking sagittal plane, so thinking about stride length, thinking about where we're making initial contact versus center of mass or versus flexing knee. So obviously we will talk about the interplay between stride length in a relative term and cadence, but also from a stride width perspective, that lends us nicely to talk about the more kind of indirect coaching. So we're making manipulation to the cadence of a runner is very much what we call a direct coaching intervention. So you're asking them to consciously do something different. If we ask a runner to run with a slightly wider stride width, which we'll get into in a second, using that as a direct coaching intervention, people will generally overcorrect. And it'll be very hard for them to actually, firstly, make the subtlety of correction that we're after and make that stick. And secondly, they'll potentially end up just giving themselves a problem elsewhere. So what we do is we focus more on the indirect approach. So focusing on what we're going to be doing to strengthen abductors, external rotators. So again, typically we're talking glutes, etc., as we so often do. But let's bring it back to the start point. Let's talk about stride length. Let's talk about cadence. So when it comes to running a given steady pace forwards, there are 2 variables really that we're going to be talking about that are going to determine the pace you're running. One of which is stride length, the other of which is stride frequency. So how far are you covering with each stride? How many times is that happening per minute? Stride frequency, call it what you want. Stride frequency, cadence, step rate, there are whatever terms, various different terms you could use. We'll go with cadence. So if we're holding a steady, let's say 8-minute mile, if I increase my cadence, if my pace is going to stay steady, so let's say I'm on a treadmill, if I increase my cadence, my stride length is going to shorten up. Those 2 variables balance themselves out. If I decrease my cadence, then my stride length is going to increase to maintain the same pace. Of course, when we're running over ground, pace is a variable as well, so it gets a little bit more interesting. But let's just assume pace is locked in there. What we see a hell of a lot from runners is runners who are running with, arguably, for the given pace, too slow of a cadence for that given speed they're running. So what they have to do, as the cadence is too slow, is essentially start to stride out beyond that would theoretically be optimal, beyond the point where they're landing underneath a flexing knee, and start to land that foot, typically with a heel strike, but not always, land that foot at that point of initial contact too far ahead of that more extended knee. Okay, and that's going to increase potentially the amount of ground reaction force coming back at you, but potentially really make a big change in terms of the amount of load the patellofemoral joint's going to have to deal with, and the hip's going to have to do it. Think of it as eccentric work around the knee and around the hip. And we're just going to talk sagittal plane right now, but be aware that, of course, we're talking 3 dimensions, 3 planes of motion. So what we want to do in many cases is, if we've got a runner coming in with patellofemoral pain, for example, and they are showing us that typical heel striking, not that the heel strike's the big issue, it's more so the where the foot's landing rather than how, but it is typically that heel striking, overstriding pattern where they're landing with that heel well in front of the knee. What we can do is, in that instance, when we're observing that, we can measure cadence, and sometimes we'll see perhaps it's a runner running at a self-selected easy pace around about maybe 160 strides per minute. So 160 would be left and right combined. You could also, of course, reference that as 80. Doesn't matter. It's up to you. But take that runner and start to apply incremental increases in cadence. What we see a lot of people make the mistake of, especially once they perhaps read an article in Runner's World or online or somewhere, and they've seen 180 as being flagged up as this kind of ideal cadence for all runners to run at, is they'll take themselves, perhaps they are this Jeff who's running at 160 strides per minute at their comfortable pace, and they'll simply set a metronome and they'll start trying to run to an artificially very much faster cadence, and it'll feel very, very staccato, for want of a better term, very choppy, very very short, and almost like they're running, almost like it feels like they're running in place. Certainly not something they can sustain, certainly not something that feels comfortable and fluid. A lot of the time, that's where people get frustrated with it and end up bailing on that whole idea after a fairly short period of time. But instead, if we work on a principle of increasing by 5%, 10%, perhaps finding somewhere in the middle, 7.5%, then we could take Jeff, who's running at 160 strides per minute, and take him to 168 strides per minute, which would be a 5% increase. And there is evidence to support the fact that that will reduce the amount of, again, think of it very basically as eccentric load around the knee, by just increasing by 5% at that same self-selected pace. And that in itself, again, can be enough, in my experience, for a lot of runners to start to, alongside all the other various different interventions we're going to be using from a patellofemoral pain point of view, be enough to help set them on their way as we get back into a return to run program. And with that return to run program, we're looking at, as we should be, a progressive walk run program. The nature of, let's say, doing the first session of 8 to 10 times 1 minute run, 1 minute walk at an easy pace, what they can do for those 1 minute is they can consciously be working on that metronome, beat, 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 to land on that 180 steps. And then when they're walking. And then when they're back to that the next minute, they're back to that, not 180, 168 steps. They're again back on the cadence they're trying to dial in. And then over time, we're increasing the run durations, reducing the walk durations, depending on how long the walk run program is, to get them to the point where we are increasing their training load, increasing the amount of running they're doing. So very basically, very broadly, and just talking about one variable there, which is generally not the way from a coaching point of view I go, but if we're looking at something that's really practical and you can do in clinic, grabbing a metronome, grabbing some baseline data at a given pace and saying, right, Jeff, with your patellofemoral pain, we can see that you're overstriding. We can see that your cadence is pretty low. We could actually quite easily dial that up a little bit, not by making big jumps, but by making incremental changes. Think 5%, 7.5%, 10%. Let's see how it feels as we get you back into that when the time is right to reintroduce running. And that's certainly something that I know Brad has seen a lot of success with in clinic. Again, as I mentioned, from my point of view, I'm looking at a couple of different things at once when I'm coaching. Usually again, from again, talking about kind of development of a coach over time, the big thing I've had to work on over the last 10 years is not overcoaching, not going, here's 10 things to work on. It's more so say, right, we're going to dial this down to the big rocks, if you like, and saying, right, okay, we're going to start with cadence and factor on top of that posture, because again, we can talk about how the two affect one another. But just starting to help people become aware of their cadence, find a comfortable yet increased point that's going to, again, from a tissue loading point of view, make sense. That's where we can start to push people in the right direction. Ian, is this something that you've had much of a chance to play with in clinic?
Yeah, Brad and I play with it quite a lot. Sometimes we have a little dabble before we send them to you, and sometimes we don't, depends how busy we are on things. But I think the key thing to touch on here, which I hopefully it's become clear already, is we don't change the technique of people who aren't in pain. When I say we, I mean myself, Brad, I mean you as well, in my experience. And, you touched on it there. I asked you, what should we be looking at to change? And the first thing you talked about was cadence in the context of patellofemoral pain. And I'm very much the same in that, and perhaps when we talk about some of the other changes, we'll bring in the sort of pathologies that we know we have context with there. But we got really, really good data, a massive amount of data that shows how patellofemoral joint forces change with different step lengths and increasing cadence. And I think that's the key take-home message here. We don't just change people's running because we don't like it or because it doesn't conform to some predetermined ideal. We're changing it in the context of pain. And I think that's perhaps that's something we didn't say at the start, but we should have. But hopefully it becomes clear to everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that again, for those interested, there's a podcast actually that I released a couple of episodes ago where I was interviewed by the incoming presenter on our podcast. And we were talking about the ways in which I've changed over time. And to kind of paraphrase a little bit, we were talking about the fact that, maybe 10 years ago, when I, again, was working under someone else's roof and I was a little bit more green, let's say, I was definitely the guy who thought that, changing running technique would bring world peace. It was the cure for everything. It was, and it's kind of awkward and embarrassing thinking back.
That's orthosis. They're orthoses.
Yeah, exactly. Like I say, it's kind of awkward and embarrassing thinking back, but it's quite funny at the same time. Luckily, there are no horrendous horror stories as to where it all went wrong. I think I was quite lucky in that respect. Now, as a more experienced coach, knowing that if someone comes to me saying, I want to PB over 5K, can you turn me into a 4-foot runner? Because I think that's going to be the answer. I'm going to have a very serious conversation with them and just say, look, this probably isn't where you want to be heading. This is only something that realistically I want to be guided by at least injury history, if not something you're dealing with at the moment. If not, I don't really want to touch your running technique. I want more so to, if you are serious about this and you're okay with your running, you're not in pain at the moment, you're not injured at the moment, let's look at all the other variables. Craig was talking about rest earlier. How's the quality of your rest and recovery, your sleep? What are you doing training plan wise? What are you doing strength conditioning wise? What are you doing from a nutrition standpoint? There are so many different variables. How's your pacing? It might not be your form. You might just be horrendous at pacing your park run on a Saturday morning. So there are so many conversations to be had before let's just blindly play with your running form. It has to be guided by some sort of clinical reasoning. I suppose that's the best way of saying it.
So let's move on then. So if someone present, summary of that for me, at least in my simple mind, is if I've got a runner and they present with patellofemoral pain, amongst all the other things we do as well, one of the things I'll always try and look for is, or try and capture in the clinic, is what I think their cadence and their step length is. Let's move on to step width. Again, just throwing in a bit of the data, we got pretty good published work that sort of suggests the context here would be medial tibial stress syndrome and or these sort of issues. So talk to everyone a bit about step width and your thoughts on that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, definitely. So from a perspective, from a retraining perspective, if we decided that step width is going to be relevant when it comes to dealing with someone who, again, whether it's post tendinopathy, whether it's ITB syndrome. I've also had good results with people struggling with plantar fasciitis as well. But again, that's, I've got nothing to stand behind in that respect. That's just very much my experience. The big thing, firstly, I want to look at, if I think someone is landing either very much kind of either on this tightrope or on opposite sides of our tightrope, is I wanted to take a quick look skeletally. I want to see, are we dealing with a big fat tibial varum, which might be setting them up to land in that position, or is it more so something which is coming as a result of poor proximal control higher up the chain? More often than not, in my experience, again, is more to do with proximal control. And that's where asking runners to do something different, asking runners to use those classic kind of classic coaching cues, if you like, of trying to run on the double yellow lines or run 1 foot either side of the white line. For me, they don't work. You'll hear runners who have got success stories of saying that I tried this and it worked for me, as you will barefoot running, as you will all sorts of wacky things. But for me, it's got to be more so looking at what's not doing a great job to around particularly that kind of lumbo-pelvic hip region to provide the control and stability that we need, which is therefore allowing us to land in that more adapted position. So again, that's where we turn to the rehab gym a little bit more than just asking them to do something different cognitively when they're running. So that's where we're making sure that we're getting them onto a solid, again, not just glute retraining program. There's actually and again, I don't know what you guys think of them. And again, there was a period where I was consuming a reasonable amount of their content, but not so much in recent years. But there's a good video from the Gait guys, where as much as the audio, you have to strain to hear it. They were talking about various different drills and cues to actually start recruiting muscles like the obliques that little bit more when we're in a single leg stance to help, again, control hip and pelvis. So various different drills you can use and cues you can use to, again, help runners improve proximal control on that single leg stance. But again, I suppose, bring it back to simple terms, it's focusing more on non-running interventions than focusing on something which is very much consciously landed with your feet further apart. Does that make sense, Ian?
Yeah, so I mean, what you're saying is rather than tell them how to change the way they run, you sort of rehab it away from running, and you find, in your experience, you find it carries over. Is that essentially what?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. If there's some sort of strength endurance deficit, that when they get tired, and I noticed there's a question from Emma Cowley in the comments, do you analyse long distance runners in their fatigued state? That's really important. Yeah, if there's some sort of strength endurance issue there, that when they get tired, they start to get a little bit more poor from a control perspective around the hips, then we need to do some work on actually building the resilience around there to actually get to a point where they're better at controlling that. And yeah, that for me is far more effective than just asking them to consciously do something different. Because if we're asking them to do something consciously different, if genuinely they can kinematically make a change to how they're moving on this from a frontal plane, again, keeping it straightforward and simple, but a frontal plane point of view, then something's working harder to achieve that. They're having to consciously work harder, and maybe we're going to, by consciously focusing on making them really, really focus on creating that wider stride width, are we maybe going to start overloading areas like glute med? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I don't want to take them away from having a tib post problem and give them a glute med tendinopathy. That's probably a bit extreme, but you understand the thinking there, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think Craig refers to this as it being a zero-sum game, in that the forces in the system are always going to be equal. So if you, by definition, if you successfully reduce load on one structure, great for that structure, but you have definitely increased it somewhere else. And the question then becomes, where's it gone, and will that place tolerate it? So I think it's one of the things that we tend to, as I'm sure you do, counsel the runner on before we make these changes. We say, look, this is your pathology. This is the the thing that we're going to consider changing. This is the evidence that supports that and the rationale for doing so. But you know what? Before we dive into it, here are the considerations, here are the possible trade-offs. And one of them is, will we give you, niggles elsewhere? And the other one is, often because they ask, is, and we don't want to go too much down the performance road, but I certainly remember reading data that the way that we move from A to B is sort of a decision made by our central nervous system based on the most metabolically efficient way to get there. And it's arrogant of any of us to assume if we tweak that, we're not probably going to increase the metabolic cost in the short term, at least. I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but I certainly tell patients we might make something else hurt. We might actually make you less efficient to start with. We don't really have the data to know where it goes in the future. But I just then let them make an informed decision as an adult, if that's what they want to do.
Yeah, definitely. And that sounds similar in different words to some of the ways I try and set up some of the conversations I have. So I try and quite early on explain that the way in which you run is very much kind of an expression of your body trying to move through the path of least resistance. So you'll play to your strengths in basic terms. So it's a combination of your various strengths, weaknesses, areas of restriction, areas of really good range of motion but poor stability, etc., strength endurance layered on top of that. If I try and consciously make you change the way you're moving in anything more than a really subtle way, then we're starting to fight against that path of least resistance. We're starting to try and fight against how the body has naturally chosen that it wants to move based on what it's got to work with. So simply asking it to make that change without any other input is likely not to be a game we're going to win in the long term. And again, there's a good study out there. I can't remember. I think it might have been Pete Larson actually looking at marathon runners at the New Hampshire Marathon. Was it 2011, 2010? When they set up the cameras on the roadside, ran 10K in around 20 miles, and we saw there were a lot. Let's just very, very, very simply say there were a lot more heel strikers when we got to the 20-mile mark. And it just goes to say that fatigue is a game changer, and you can try and consciously change as much as you want, but when we start to layer in fatigue, the body's going to revert back to its path of least resistance. So if we've decided that you're running posturally in a position where potentially you're ever so slightly kind of forward tilted through the pelvis, so this anterior tilt of the pelvis, so sitting, as we colloquially talk to runners, kind of sitting back in the run, sitting back in the bucket, if you like, and we're in a position where, through being in that position where we're slightly forward tilted, naturally going to be setting up to be slightly, again, more likely to overstride, unless we do something about the reasons why. So perhaps those hip flexors are quite tight, and that's what's stopping you from getting into this nice open hip position as we're getting into what we want, real hip extension and internal rotation. If you're not able to get into that position, then asking you to do something different and fight against those tight hip flexors is not going to be a game you're going to win. So what I'd much rather do is say, this is where we're going technique-wise. This is what we're going to try and change over time. These are some cues to think about, but these are the exercises that with a 6, 8, 12 onwards week progression, we're going to get you to a point where your body's going to be more willing to move in a way that we'd like it to move as a runner. And some of them, this is what I mentioned about my uninjured runner. Some of them are going to be your more generic kind of exercises that we want to see runners doing from a point of view of making sure that we can keep everything moving as we want to, so particularly around the hips. And some of them are going to be really pathology specific as well, depending on what we want to rehab, how we want to rehab it. So the exercises underpin the changes we're trying to make. I don't remember how I got on to talking about this, so Ian, there you go.
Sure. Okay, James, we've just lost Ian. He'll be back in a moment, I think. What I'll do might just move. I'm actually a bit conscious of the time, but let's talk about perhaps chronic exertional compartment syndrome, the anterior compartment syndrome, where I see a lot of circumstantial evidence, a lot of reasonable clinical practice suggests that it might be related to the touchdown angle. So the more severe the touchdown angle, the harder the tibialis anterior is working, and that's predisposing to the compartment syndrome. So clinically, I've been doing this with extraordinary results, but whenever I say my experience, I think people should run away. But we do have one really good uncontrolled study showed that transitioning them to forefoot striking works really well, but there was no control group. But I don't think they need to go to forefoot striking. I just think they need to reduce the touchdown angle. If that means going to forefoot striking, it does. So I just wonder if you'd comment on that. but almost all, like practically, how do you change that touchdown angle?
Yeah, okay, so let's deal with the first thing first. Yes, I agree, totally. I've probably exactly the same experience well, probably not exactly, but you know what I mean, the same experience as you in terms of seeing quite dramatic improvements from runners who are dealing with chronic exertional compartment syndrome by bringing them to more of a midfoot to forefoot position. The big risk there, as with anyone making that change, is the fact that they're going to suddenly be, again, playing that zero-sum game and finding that their calves, their whole plantar flexor unit, are going to be experiencing something it's very much not used to. So the return to run program needs to be very gentle and very progressive. And of course, the big challenge there is the fact that all of a sudden, because particularly with that pathology, we've made a real change to their symptoms, and they're like, wow, I can run now and it's not painful. I've seen a few people who literally have gone off the deep end and just gone and freestyled it completely and been so excited to be able to run that they've done themselves some damage from a plantar flexor point of view. So again, being really, really on it from a compliance point of view and giving them very strict parameters is important. But I think the point you make, Craig, is super important, that it doesn't need to be black and white. It doesn't need to be two ends of a spectrum, two ends of a spectrum. There is plenty of difference between landing with this heavy, aggressive heel strike with a very aggressive inclination. As I talk to runners, I talk about kind of toes up to the sky as we're looking at them from side on. Big difference between that and loading with what I refer to as a proprioceptive heel strike, and that's, again, proprioceptive heel strike, kissing heel strike, whatever you want to call it. The sort of heel strike where, when I'm doing some 2D gait analysis with runners and we're reviewing the footage together, looking from the side on, they'll turn to me and say, I thought I was forefoot striking, but I can see my heel striking first. Typically, we're seeing that they're making such a light and fleeting contact with the rear foot visually with the ground, but really in terms of peak loading rates, not happy to across the midfoot in comparison to these guys, where peak loading rates can be coming up at that point of the point of initial contact right up through the rear foot. It's getting to a point where if we can bring, just to fast forward a little bit rather than just rambling on about that, if we can get your runners who are suffering with chronic exertional compartment syndrome, who we're not looking to make that big change to a forefoot position, if we can bring them to a point where it's that gentle heel strike, not by asking them to suddenly either not land on your heels, which is a cue which will throw someone to the forefoot aggressively, they'll overcook it, or not giving them the cue of land on your toes, but instead give them the cue of trying to run tall, hold themselves that little bit more upright, bring their hips up and forward, then naturally bringing the hips and pelvis up and forward over the top of that landing foot without consciously focusing on what that landing foot's doing. It'll allow them to actually get away from a position where they're perhaps landing so far in front of themselves, because naturally they brought their center of mass slightly forwards, which will, again, naturally find a point where they're slightly less aggressive with that angle of the sole of the foot to the ground. There's a nice graphic, actually, in the paper, it's the Heiderscheit paper, I think, from 2011, I think it was, where they actually graphically represented the differing positions at, what was it, self-selected cadence versus plus 5%, plus 10%. And if you look at the foot in that respect, you can really see graphically quite nicely the differing angle of inclination of the foot to the ground. And if we think about the body as a whole unit, and we think about if we were to just lock off the foot there, if we can imagine that that's, if we were talking bike fit as an example, if that's kind of you locked into the pedal, if we brought you up and forward around the bottom bracket, from a bike fit point of view, we're bringing the pelvis up and forwards over the top of that foot, then naturally you're going to go from being there to being there that little bit more. So again, coming forwards is the best way of thinking about it, and just trying to hold your hips high is the best way of getting there. Do you see where I'm going with that? Because I used a very sketchy analogy there.
Yeah, no, totally. Again, I'm still conscious of the time. Perhaps Ian, okay, something You're there, Ian. You just
sorry, guys. Yeah, I appear to be having some Wi-Fi issues. I don't know what's going on. What did I miss? Did I miss anything good?
Anterior compartment syndrome. Yeah, actually, James, just following up one comment you made about the forefoot rear foot strike. Like we've been going almost an hour, and we haven't even touched on that, which tells you probably how important it is. To most people, gait retraining is all about forefoot striking versus rear foot striking, and the fact that we've hardly touched it, I think, explains it. I'm sure you had contact with Brian Martin down here in Australia, and one thing he said to me many years ago, and he's what I think is a very good running technique coach. He says, I never look at their foot strike. You just sort their proximal hips out and the foot takes care of itself and it falls where it falls. And I think ever since then, that's stuck in my mind as not a major issue. And I know Martin Shorten presented something quite funny at a conference recently where he showed data that the mean touchdown angle was 16.9 degrees dorsiflexed. But there's also a very nice bell-shaped curve around that. Like it wasn't a double hump curve of forefoot versus rear foot. It was a continuum. But when you look at the data closer, forefoot strikers were more than 2 standard deviations from the mean. And in medicine, if you're more than 2 standard deviations from the mean, you're in the abnormal category. And he was trying to be funny, but like it was interesting. But it was interesting that it was a perfect bell-shaped curve. So there wasn't forefoot versus rear foot. It was this very nice continuum. And that's
really interesting.
So stuck in my mind.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Excellent. So, I mean, we wanted to talk a little bit around upper body. Now, I'm very wary again that time-wise we're struggling, but I completely echo. Before we hopefully move on to that, I completely echo your point around how we've managed to cover so much without even needing to go near the whole foot strike issue, specifically forefoot, rear foot. Again, great to hear you referencing Brian there. I haven't heard from Brian Martin in the longest time.
No, either have I.
No, excellent. I hope he's doing all right. The big thing that I wanted to quickly bring up with that is actually there's a chap over here in the UK who we were talking, and this was a few years ago, and it really made my a few bells ring in my ear as if to say, why haven't you thought of that before? In terms of retraining, particularly to get people away from overstriding, and whether they're forefoot, rear foot striking with an overstride, whatever, but getting them away from overstriding is actually to focus on starting to actually try and cue in a little bit more hip flexion, and start to talk about why adding in a little bit more hip flexion, as much as from a point of view contralateral. On the contralateral side, getting a little bit better hip extension out the back end from a cross-extensor reflex point of view. That's what I was tripping over. What we're going to start to see is they actually start to get more of that ground coverage through the amount of knee, the hip flexion they're getting. So think from a running perspective, as we talk to our runners, knee drive rather than hip flexion, rather than having to swing that lower leg forwards and try and almost overreach for the ground when they're running with, for the given pace, too little hip flexion. So something for you guys to mull over a little bit. I don't want to get into that too much. I'd much rather talk about the upper body.
Yeah. Well, let's just touch on some of the upper body issues that perhaps we should be looking for or looking at that might be impacting on what we're doing further down the chain.
Totally. So from my perspective, let's talk about how things have changed over the years for me, just as the way in which my brain interprets things, the way in which I see things when looking at runners. So again, the old version of me would have very much looked at someone who is running with this typical swinging arm across the midline, so hand coming almost across the opposite shoulder, either fairly symmetrically or in an asymmetrical kind of fashion. I'd look at that and say, well, perhaps that's something we can get more efficient with and start to get you being slightly more linear in what you're trying to do, and stop using all this wasted energy. That makes sense. But actually, as I've got more experience over time, I've begun to understand that there's a reason. There's a reason why that's happening. And when we start to understand walking gait, running gait, that little bit better, of course, we understand the rotation and counter rotation that goes on, and the necessity for that from a point of view of the whole system, not even breaking things down into segments. And if we're starting to see at the top end, so we're looking at the upper body and torso showing lots of rotation, more than we deem normal perhaps, or an asymmetrical kind of rotation, we need to, rather than just say that's something we could tidy up, in inverted commas, we need to think more so, what's that balancing out? What's that starting to try and create some sort of balance for? Again, a great example of a runner who, despite all sorts of interesting rotational issues, is clearly doing a lot very well is Priska Jepsu. So if we, again, I'll be able to jump into the comments later and perhaps show you guys a bit of running footage around her for anyone who doesn't know what I'm talking about. But she's an elite Kenyan marathon runner who is running with this double arm mixing bowl action with this big knee valgus on both sides going on and this fairly horrible pelvic control. But she's winning marathons, so fair enough. But for a lot of us runners, for a lot of us from a clinical point of view and a coaching point of view, if we're seeing a runner who is showing us that their hand is drifting off towards the midline or across the midline and they're rotating more so to one side, or we're seeing this big side flexion of the trunk, we've got to ask ourselves, what's that creating balance for? So again, typically, if we're going to talk about that side flexion of the trunk, if when I'm landing on, I don't know if I'm mirrored on this screen, but if I'm landing on left side and I'm in left side stance and I'm leaning to the same side, then I'm trying to bring my center of mass over the top of that same hip, which potentially might show me that from a frontal plane perspective, I'm not doing a great job of stabilizing that hip. So we might not be seeing a typical Trendelenburg sign. We might not see a big knee valgus position. It might be more of a subtle tell. It might be more that actually we're having to shift our center of mass to try and compensate for the fact that we don't stabilize that hip well when we're in a single leg stance. Is that going to be something related to the piriformis syndrome that the person's dealing with? Maybe, maybe not. You need to look closer, but it's just a tell. It's just a little hint that we can look at. Do I ask them not to lean over to the side? Of course I don't. I want to start to go deeper and start to strengthen what needs strengthening, rehab what needs rehabbing, and consistently we start to see little changes, little improvements come along off the back of just starting to improve the underlying capabilities, if you like, the underlying factors, the underlying traits there. From an arm action point of view, the biggest realization I had in years about upper body was that it's the action of the arms in dampening rotation. So the arms are there. There's lots of rotation going on with the arms. Well, it's dampening excessive rotation elsewhere. So what's that telling you? So again, no solid answers from my point of view in this perspective, because it's person by person, but you've got to use what you're seeing from an upper body perspective. If it's to your eye, if it's saying that doesn't look quite right, then probably look proximally and look again.
Yeah. Great, thanks, James. I think we've just gone over an hour and I have to leave shortly to do the parenting thing, get the girls to school. But before we finish up, what I'll do, I'll just share my screen of James's website. For those of you who are not familiar with it, I'm sure you can find it, kinetic-revolution.com, with an extraordinary amount of resources, coaching videos, the 30-day challenge, workshops and courses, lots of really, really good blog posts. Now, there is a couple of your blog posts, James, that I actually refer people to quite regularly. One mainly being the one on calf pain. I don't know whether you've, like even myself, I did actually try to transition a bit to some minimalist running, and I certainly suffered extraordinary amount. And so I do refer to that a lot. There's a lot of other good resources there. So
thank you, mate. I appreciate it.
Before we go, Craig, let's just, for everyone listening, let's just try and really quickly summarize everything, if that's okay. Just like the abstract of an article, because some people are only just coming in. Bottom line, we don't play around with running technique of people who are uninjured. In the context of certain pathology, there may be things we want to look at, such as stride length and cadence for patellofemoral pain, step width for medial tibial stress syndrome or ITB. It's not necessarily about the foot, how the foot strikes. It's probably more about where it strikes. One thing we haven't touched on is, and I know that James has been sort of referring to, is his phrase that I like, which is this minimal effective change. So we we don't make big changes. We try and make the smallest change we can to have a positive effect. And if ultimately, as a podiatrist, if we're seeing runners, it's absolutely, in my opinion, important that we have a relationship with a running coach. And the red flags, going back to Dave's question, are to be concerned about is if a running coach seems to have a sort of all-encompassing approach. They shoot for 180 cadence in everyone. They are telling people that they need to foot strike in a different way. Does that pretty much sum up the last hour? Anything I've missed?
I think so, mate. I think that's pretty much it in a nutshell. I mean, there are various other little bits and pieces that, you know, for example, you referencing minimum effective change that we probably should have thrown in a little bit earlier. Something that I'm going to leave you guys to discuss, leave everybody to discuss in the comments, which is, I think, aligned with, or there was a comment I saw a second ago with, I can't remember, I can't find it. But anyway, basically leave you with the thought of trail running. Runners don't do enough of it, because I think it's something which the variability and the mixed workout that trail running gives versus road running is so handy for a lot of runners. So that's something that we can perhaps discuss in the comments.
Sure. Okay, well, thanks, James, so much. Thanks, Ian.
Thanks, mate.
Stop the live stream.